Belonging is such a shifting experience, and belonging is a powerful thing, and so much of what we're going to be speaking about tonight is about belonging. I'm Pádraig. I have been doing some poems throughout the day. I'm a poet and a theologian, and for the last 20 years I've been involved in conflict resolution in Belfast, and for the last 5 years I led Corrymeela, which is Ireland's oldest peace and reconciliation organisation. It was set up in 1965 and has been working with about 10,000 people a year since 1965 on programs of peace and reconciliation in schools, in communities, with political groups, with religious groups, with all kinds of groups, and not only in Ireland as well, also people who come to Ireland seeking to learn about our reconciliation program. We're not a political advocacy group, more so Corrymeela is a group that is interested in transforming division through human encounter, not by saying, oh, it's all lovely, let's have pretty little conversations with ourselves, much more so by saying, let's learn how to argue really, really well, and let's learn that the best argument can happen in a place where there is no practicing of threat, but you can say seriously difficult things to each other in the place of argument. So a couple of things I'm going to do tonight. I'm going to start off by saying some things about Britain, and then I'm going to continue by saying a little bit about British-Irish history, and then a little bit about the Book of Ruth and why it is that tonight I'm going to talk about the Book of Ruth. And then maybe at the end we could take some questions, because I think that would be very interesting. I'll say a little bit about the European Union as well as constitutional democracy. Can I check? Can you hear me? Not so well. Is it better if I go like this? Okay. Should I start over again? No. Some of you raised your hands. I'm Miranda. So, I want to start off by speaking about Britain. Britain is very near to here. Britain is an island comprising of 3 nation states, England, Scotland and Wales. There are multiple language traditions in Britain. There is the Scots language, which is very influenced by Dutch, because previous to the Act of Union, Scotland's closest trading partner was the Netherlands. There is English, obviously, and there is Welsh and Cornish, beautiful languages related to each other. They're part of the Brittonic Celtic language tradition. And then up in Scotland, there's what's called Scots Gaelic, which is related to Irish, and Manx as well, which is a Gaelic language spoken on the Isle of Man, which is halfway between Ireland and Britain. So the island of Britain is an island, like the rest of Europe, that has multiple language traditions existing within it, and multiple belongings existing within it also. I grew up speaking Irish and English, and at the age of 5 I said to my parents, why don't we speak Irish all the time? And they said, well, there's this place called England, and they like to go places. That was a childhood introduction to the question of colonization. And I don't think it's possible to be a politically aware Irish person without having to reckon very seriously with your relationship with the island of Britain. And by reckon seriously, I don't just mean accuse them. I also mean think, what is it that is good about that island of Britain? And there is so much. There's a vast cultural tradition there. I love Jane Austen and Jeanette Winterson and so many people in between. Of course, there's poets like Shakespeare also. There has been an extraordinary century of bravery in the 20th century. There were centuries of something other than that beforehand, but it's really important to recognize that, like many countries, not unique, but really distinguishing themselves among the many, is the bravery that Britain showed in the 20th century regarding European wars. And then also I see extraordinary bravery and brilliance shown by Britain in the Good Friday Agreement, which brought to a culmination 800 years of disordered relationship in terms of how Britain had treated Ireland. The Good Friday Agreement, if you ever have a chance to read it, it's free online, you'll find it in loads of places. is a beautiful demonstration about what political agreement can look like. It's very moving. It's like a secular encyclical for hoping about how 800 years of pain can be culminated into something of a shared practice of mutual belonging, especially in a situation where nobody agrees who the main aggressor was. I mean, Ireland is pretty clear that Britain is the main aggressor in the question of colonisation, and I'm pretty clear that that's the case too. But for the purpose of peace, the Good Friday Agreement plays this little fiction to say, oh look, there's blame everywhere. Okay, I will take that, because you need to compromise when you're coming together in peace. And Britain has done some extraordinary things in the Good Friday Agreement, and not only in the Good Friday Agreement, also into the investigation into the Bloody Sunday Massacre. As you know, there was a Bloody Sunday Massacre where 11 or 13 people were gunned down by the British Army, mostly Catholics, marching for civil rights in Derry in the early 70s. And there was a quick and immediate and terrible and predetermined investigation done into that in the early 70s, and it determined that those people who were shot were the ones who started to fire first, okay? But that was total lies, an absolute fabrication. In the late 90s, Tony Blair ordered an investigation into that annihilation and murder, and that investigation, I think, lasted 10 years. Millions and millions and millions of pounds was put into it. And I wish to God more governments held themselves to account in the way that the British government did. It's a demonstration of the most extraordinary integrity. And it's a gesture to say, this is also what democracy can look like. So it's really important for me to say that Britain is a place that were I living there and were I from there, I'd want to be really proud of. Not of everything. There's things in every country's history to feel deep shame about. But because tonight I'm going to be saying some complicated things about Britain in terms of how it speaks to Ireland contemporarily as well as historically, it's really important to me. Some of you might be British, some of you might have shared British heritage or have lived there and loved it there. I want everybody who lives in Britain to love it. And partly my anxiety is that, especially in England, England is disappointing itself in this whole Brexit project, and disappointing what a European imagination can be and what an EU imagination can be. I'll say a little bit about the EU too, is that one of the damages that the Brexit project has done really has been to reduce the public discussion about the question of the EU to the question of a trade agreement, or a question of goods and services crossing borders. The EU has been responsible, it won the Nobel Peace Prize for God's sake, has been responsible for the longest peacetime in the European continent for a very long time. And it is a complicated entity, a bureaucratic entity. I used to work for the European Peace and Reconciliation Group, and so I knew all about procurement and things that drove me crazy about European Union requirements when it came to spending money. And in the midst of that, I wouldn't change it for a second, because I think if in 50 years we were to imagine that the Middle East had some kind of Middle East civic union that didn't diminish the identities but did bring identities together in a shared project, and if people in 50 years were saying, oh God, the Syrians are upset because there's a bit too much administration, we'd think, keep your administration. Paperwork isn't a bad thing when it spares lives. You know, maybe you'll feel like your life is slipping away by filling in another piece of paperwork, but that doesn't mean being shot. And so administration and bureaucracy is not such a bad thing when it's bringing about and sustaining and maintaining a peace that would have seemed unimaginable before. The question about British and Irish relationships goes back 700 or 800 years, depending as to who you talk to. And so most British people don't know this. And so British people who come to Ireland very quickly are brought into a long and complicated history lesson when they move to Ireland in terms of the attempts that Britain had made over centuries to colonise Ireland. because Ireland wasn't one kingdom, they'd take over a little bit and the rest of us would be like, that's fine, we don't like them anyway, keep them. Dublin became known as the Pale for a while. Hence in English we still have that phrase, beyond the pale, if you feel like somebody has gone beyond something that came from that particular era. Dublin was English speaking for a lot longer than the rest of Ireland. In Dublin you find all kinds of architecture there also that does demonstrate a longer British presence there than anywhere else in the country really. And Britishness was seeking to use Ireland for some kind of place of agriculture and for some kind of place of the beginning of the colonial project. Ireland in a certain sense was a test ground before other places, India, Australia, the United States, were taken over in terms of that, and certain things were tried out in Ireland that were then taken further. Lessons were learned from the Irish project by Britain that were then taken further in terms of their own stated aims for what success looks like. As a brief date, you can point to 1801, or we're looking actually even earlier than that. You can point to the seizing of lands in Ulster and some people in Ulster, which is the northernmost province. Ireland only has 4 provinces, and Ulster is the northernmost province. Some earls there fled to Europe to seek for help from the French or the Spanish or whoever was listening, and to look for help in terms of a war against Britain as Britain was seizing land. And those people who fled never came back, and so Britain seized their lands. And then this particular northern part of Ireland it was really the prototype for what Northern Ireland would be like when Britain partitioned us 100 years ago. This was not done with the approval of local people, of course. Local people were Irish speaking, were Catholic, and considered themselves living in Ireland. By 1801 or 1802, Britain had declared Ireland part of the United Kingdom. It was called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland up until the 1920s. And Ireland was providing a huge amount of the percentages of corn and beef for Britain during that time. By 1845, Ireland had a population of 9 million, which is a very, very high population. Today, the population is probably 6.6 million. By the time the famine happened in 1845, and we never call it the potato famine because it was not a potato famine. It was a policy famine. There was enough food to feed everybody being produced in the country, most of it being shipped off to England, being shipped in boats, being piled up by people who were dying of starvation. 1 million people died in 3 years, 1 million people left. There was about 9 million people in 1845. By the time 1880 came along, the population was 4 million. It's an extraordinary devastation. Ireland alone in Western Europe has a much smaller population now than in 1845. Everywhere else in Western Europe has a higher population, it seems. And so Ireland has had a long struggle in terms of the question about independence and the question about what identity means. Because the north of Ireland had been used as a plantation, lands had been taken. Is that coming from outside? The Protestant landowners were planted in the northern part of Ireland, and so that immediately meant that there was more wealthy Protestant people and poorer Catholic people. By this stage, the English language was becoming more required. Some people would go so far as to say that the British made the Irish language illegal. And so some people, to better the futures of their children, wished that their children would speak English and not Irish. And so as time went by, fewer people were speaking different languages, and we all kind of looked the same. So one of the main ways to tell which tribe you were whether you were Catholic or Protestant. Catholic being seen as an Irish religion, Protestant being seen as a British religion. It wasn't deep disagreements about theology. These are ways within which tribal groupings happen. And that's so whenever you hear in the Irish context of Catholic, Protestant, you really should understand them in terms of their political tribalisms, in terms of British identifying or Irish identifying. There had been various uprisings seeking for Ireland to have our own independence, and it was almost about to happen in 1915, but then World War I broke out. And then when World War I broke out, there was a small uprising in Dublin. Not too many people were involved in the uprising, but the British assassinated the people involved in the uprising very quickly without trial. And that ignited an entire people. So by the end of World War I, it was really clear that Ireland was going to get some semblance of independence. Because Britain had been planting British Protestants in the north for so long, and these at this stage were not only wealthy, they were also poor, working class Protestants from Scotland. There was a deep division in the north of Ireland particularly, a concentrated community of population there between people who said, we don't want Ireland to become its own country, we like this being part of Britain in that part. So the compromise arrived at in 1920, 1921 was that this new state called Northern Ireland would be created, that Ireland would get its independence, 26 of the 32 counties, but that 6 counties in the north for 3 years, hear that, 3 years, would be this little state called Northern Ireland. And there was going to be a review. I don't know who drew the border, but the border is ridiculous. Most of it just goes through farms. Some of it goes through houses. In some people's house, if Brexit goes through, they can be having a cup of tea in their bedroom, and if they go to their kitchen to get milk, they'll be importing or exporting dairy product across the European Union frontier. And that is not a joke. That's really serious. If you have cattle and your farm straddles the border, if you make cheese and your farm straddles the border, how are you supposed to register currently in a farm that straddles the border? It's really complicated, and nobody in Westminster seems to have thought about this whatsoever. I think that's perfectly clear. So this border was introduced for 3 years. In 1924, there was supposed to be a border commission that was to investigate as to whether the border was working. But this border commission of 1924 was cancelled by the British, and I'll give you the reason why. This is the formal reason. It was cancelled because Ireland had not paid back the debts of empire, which apparently means renting your own country from the people who stole your country. It's a terrible thing to think about, the idea that empire brings debts. It doesn't. It brings obligations. So this border stayed around. Northern Ireland was created formally as a Protestant state for a Protestant people. Don't hear that as religion, hear that as tribe and political identity. There were 70% Protestant British people in Northern Ireland when it was created, 30% Catholic. As time went by, that population changed. There was gerrymandering, really clearly, and there was clear civic inequalities. There were really poor Catholic and Protestant people, but Catholic people were saying that they had little recourse to justice. And so there was a civil rights movement in the 1960s that was really getting a lot of attention from Catholics and Protestants. And then a violent campaign started by the IRA began in the late 60s that took some of the civil rights desire for civic change for poor people, not just Catholic poor people, but all poor people. And that took some of that and ignited it into what became known as 30 years of Troubles. And Troubles comes from the Irish word for tribloidí, which means bereavements. So Troubles isn't just, a little bit of bother. Troubles to our ear, if you're an Irish speaker, means bereavement. In 1973-74, British and Irish government agencies were working together to think, what's a solution? And they wrote a solution, and it's a damn fine solution. It eventually became known as the Good Friday Agreement 25 years later. But the Good Friday Agreement, signed in 1998, most of that was written in 1973, 1974. It was all there. But it seems like people in power thought, well, if I'm seen to engage with peace, maybe I won't get re-elected. Maybe it'll be a compromise too far. Britain was unwilling to renounce sovereignty over Northern Ireland. Dublin was unwilling to renounce constitutional claim over the north of Ireland. And so what happened in 1998 is eventually the weariness from war had grown too much, so much so that the governments eventually thought, okay, there is energy on the ground now and energy in politics for us to say, let's come to a compromise. And the Good Friday Agreement is not a peace agreement for Northern Ireland. That's really important for you to know. The Good Friday Agreement is a peace agreement between Britain and Ireland after 700 years of poor relations. Most people in Britain haven't read it, never mind know what it's about. Ireland had a referendum, north and south, and because Britain is a parliamentary democracy, they don't have it written into their law books what to do with referenda. That's why Brexit was such a joke, because parliamentary democracies are made to have Parliament debate things. Constitutional democracies like the Republic of Ireland have really, really, really clear laws about what to do when you're having a referendum. All of the decisions and the proposals have to be made before the referendum, and people vote on the proposal. And they've had full access to all of the readings and the implications of that before they vote, because you're changing the Constitution. And so partly because the Good Friday Agreement had to take part in both jurisdictions in Ireland to be voted in, it had to be really clear, because it had to be a legal vote in the Republic of Ireland. The Brexit vote really, I think, was the Tory party in Britain not being sure what to do about their own split party, and they thought, let's do the equivalent of Britain's Got Talent and get people to vote something off. They don't have referenda written into their constitution. Britain's parliamentary democracy is amazing. It truly is amazing. Their parliamentary rules are enviable. They are brilliant. And when you follow the rules, some really, really interesting things can happen. Like, they truly can teach the world a lot. But parliamentary democracies shouldn't mess around with constitutional questions when you don't have a written constitution. It's just a really clear way. Use your own rules to solve your own problems. And it was a populism idea that went about. It's true to say that England, particularly, more so than Scotland or Wales, England has been more Eurosceptic, about 5 times more Eurosceptic than any other jurisdiction in the European Union. Typically in the European Union, about 6% of people in most jurisdictions are anxious about the European Union and feel like, oh, they interfere a bit. In England, that's 32% of people. So that's a really interesting indication. Scotland and Wales also are 6% in those places, but England has a higher level. Maybe that's an old echo of empire. Maybe it's not such a bad thing. It's an interesting piece of sociology to know that. Certainly the Tory party in England were falling apart and were being split between people who wanted to stay in the European Union and people who wanted to leave, and people who wanted something of a compromise in between. So David Cameron called for a referendum, and he put it through with no preparation. A sheet of paper folded into 3 was sent around every house who was eligible to vote. I didn't even get one, and it didn't mention Northern Ireland once. Irish people, north and south of the border, were screaming about this. We were not silent. We were saying, you cannot do this. You can't even ask this question. You can't ask people in England to decide whether our border becomes harder or softer. You can't do that. It's illegal. You are part of an internationally ratified treaty called the Good Friday Agreement that you need to follow through on. And you can't ask this inappropriate question of a population of people who are clearly being manipulated. Nobody was listening. We were totally ignored. So the Brexit referendum happened in May, June 2016. The Dublin government's first Brexit meeting was in December 2015. The Dublin government was more prepared for Brexit than the British government were. The Dublin government were thinking, look at what's happening. And I need to tell you that I wouldn't really vote for the Dublin government who've been around during this time. And so I'm not saying this because I'm a really loyal member of that party. They, regarding Brexit, have been brilliant. They have done, I think, exceptional work. And I'm not an automatic loyal member of that group. One of the things I think that Brexit highlights is a profound anxiety about what is England. What does it mean to be England? Most history books in England spend a lot of time looking at English histories of kings and queens, which is very interesting. Some European kings and queens as to, who married the French or the Spanish or the Dutch or the whoever, and all of that. And then spends a lot of time looking at World War I and World War II. What is utterly clear is that English history books for the English education system, I don't mean university, I just mean your average history education, while it's mandatory, English history books don't look at empire. They don't know they were in Ireland, never mind India. Never mind Australia, never mind New Zealand, never mind the impact in the North America and into South Africa, into the Middle East. I heard somebody say recently that of the 100, and this is an Englishman who said this, he's writing about Brexit and empire, that of the 190 jurisdictions registered with the United Nations, Britain has been in or tried to be in 170 of those 190. That's a lot of spreading around the place. And there is a need for civic accountability for the impact of that. And so what's really clear is that a lot of people in England think that the troubles in Ireland were troubles between Northern Ireland and what they call Southern Ireland. No such country exists. And that Britain was some kind of independent arbiter trying to bring peace, rather than thinking, actually the troubles in the north were a legacy of colonisation and a legacy of British expansion project, going into places, changing languages, changing governances, changing jurisdictions, and saying this is our country now. And we live daily today with a legacy of the past in places that have been colonised. I know that the Netherlands has been a colony too, as a coloniser, and I have spoken with some people speaking about the Netherlands practices during Remembrance Days, your annual Remembrance Days, where there has been a really ethical and interesting move, not just to remember your own war dead, but also the war dead that resulted from Dutch bullets and Dutch weaponry and Dutch armoury. And I find that to be enviable in comparison to a kind of a patriotic version of remembering that if you were to mention, well, we did bad things too in Britain, you'd be considered to be saying something that needed to be quietened rather than something that demonstrates a robust democracy and a robust accountability as a civic community. Given the difficulty then in trying to figure out how the hell do you talk about what England is when England doesn't know what it is, and England's democracy has changed its face brilliantly. England is a magnificently diverse place. I would love to live in Manchester or London. They're great places to live. Cornwall's beautiful. Northumberland's amazing. Cumbria. I did my undergrad by distance from a Birmingham college. So many amazing places in England. But I do feel sorry for England because I know that England has regularly struggled to know how do we speak about ourselves without sounding like we're being colonisers, without sounding like we're being white nationalists. How can we be proud of a country? And there's a lot to be proud about England from, but I don't think they're getting very good leadership from the people who are speaking the loudest about how to be proud about England. So Brexit seems to have been one civic manipulation for that. Now Brexit is having a terrible impact in Ireland. Corrymeela, the group that I was leading, I finished just earlier on this year in April. Corrymeela was funded by the Dublin governments for reconciliation. And so if you were to say, well, let's look at the history of England, that can be really difficult because people can feel shamed by their history, and then they'll say, oh no, you're making your history up. And if you were to say the history of the UK, well, where are the borders of the UK? I'm a nationalist. I don't consider Northern Ireland part of the UK. If people say to me, what's life like for you in the UK? I'm like, I don't live there. Sure, somebody makes a jurisdictional claim about it, but I live in Ireland. I live in a place where I can read the etymology of every place name around me. I will never speak about living in the UK. And so we have deeply divided ideas about what this territory in the north of Ireland is. And so we needed a bigger story to hold us, a story that itself wasn't controversial in order to make us think morally about how we hold ourselves together. And the Dublin government were holding some really, really good civic engagements with business leaders, with agriculture leaders, with industry leaders, but they weren't meeting with faith leaders. Now there was a lot of faith leaders going to those other community events, and some of them were even speaking, so it's not like there was persecution of faith leaders, but there wasn't any faith-specific group. And the island of Ireland has one of the highest populations of monthly attending religious people in Western Europe. 45% of people on the island of Ireland attend a religious service, a Christian religious service, once a month or more, which is a huge population of people. It had been 85% of people in 1995, so the decline is huge, but it's still a high population. So I wrote to our partners in the Dublin Fund for Reconciliation and said, you need to provide some resources for faith communities to engage with that. And they said, yeah, we know. Can you do it? And so I went, well, actually, I have an idea. And they said, what's your idea? And I said, well, there's this book in the Hebrew Bible, what some people call the Old Testament, but in the Hebrew Bible, this magnificent short book in 4 acts called the Book of Ruth. And the Book of Ruth is brilliant. God isn't an annoying character in it. Nobody's risen from the dead. Nobody flies. Nobody zooms off to hell and comes back. And nothing mad like that happens. It's a book about displaced, widowed women who cross borders and wonder whether social welfare can provide for them there, and wonder whether the question of kindness and community can change the way we hold laws and borders in our civic imagination. And the guy in the Dublin Fund for Reconciliation said, I'm going to read that book and get back to you tomorrow. And the next day he got back, he'd read it twice, and he doubled the money we asked for. It's amazing. They wanted us to work with 3,000 people over the course of a year. We worked with 6,000 people. For me, it was a project of public theology. Public theology is not interested in saying people need to believe the same things religiously. I don't give a damn. I am no evangelist. I have zero interest in changing people's minds. What I'm really, really interested in is the power of story, and the power of story to help us face ourselves. Now, I happen to think that the Book of Ruth is a magnificent and inspired piece of fiction. It was probably written during a time when there was a senior administrator in Jerusalem who had just come back from Babylon, who could be understood as the patron saint of sectarianism. Nehemiah was his name. He had this delicious idea, and you'll find this amusing. He had this great idea that Jerusalem would be made great again if you built a big wall. I'm not joking. He literally says in the last chapter of Nehemiah, you see, if you've come back from exile and you came back with a foreign spouse and half foreign children, get rid of them. Make more. Make purebloods. We don't want any mudbloods among us. It's extraordinary how this story is there. The purest idea, and the idea that there was any population anywhere that hadn't been subject to poor people moving where poor people needed to go in order to not die. That's just the history of the world, especially continental worlds, not islands so much. They're slightly more of an isolated population. But you know this very well living here, that borders have moved and changed depending as to who's queen or king. And so people have always moved back and forth across borders. And so this book, to do a quick hop, skip and a jump through it, is a book of 4 chapters. Chapter 1, there's this family from Bethlehem, which means house of bread, and Bethlehem goes through a famine, and this family, Naomi and Elimelech and her 2 sons, they go to Moab, and Moab territory is enemy territory. Moab territory is not the automatic place you'd go to if you were thinking, we're in trouble in our jurisdiction. I know we'll get a lovely welcome from our enemies. That's what they do. They go there as foreigners, and they seem to get a good welcome. The sons marry local women, and then within 10 years, the husband and the sons are dead with no children, and so they've married local women. And Naomi, who clearly cares about law, Naomi is the mother from Bethlehem. She's thinking, I have 2 daughters-in-law, and we have broken our contractual obligation to these women because we are obliged as the family into which they've married to provide them children as part of their economy. And she says to them, go home to your mothers, not your fathers. Go home to your mothers, which is a way of saying return with dignity to your family. You're not being sent with shame. Go home to your mothers because we haven't been able to fulfill the contract. She says to them, even if I were to have sons tomorrow, you'd have to wait a long time before you could marry them and before they could provide children for you. One of them goes home and the other says, no, where you go, I'll go. And so Ruth returns home with her mother. So Ruth, who becomes a foreigner, a widowed border-crossing woman, a difficult thing, and she is going back with Naomi, and Naomi does not seem to be her best self. Naomi changes her name to Bitter, Mara, and Naomi doesn't seem to be in a situation to care for Ruth, her daughter-in-law. Chapter 2, they're back in Bethlehem territory, and it's Ruth who's there. Ruth is out in the fields trying to figure out how the social welfare system works. The social welfare system works where if you have a field and you own the field, you don't harvest the corners, you leave those for widows and orphans. And somebody sees Ruth and says, she showed chesed, loving kindness, to her mother-in-law, so leave her alone, let her do it. Because there's a serious question as to whether she's entitled to till that, because she was a foreign woman married to a local man who was now dead, and they'd never lived there. So is she entitled to that social welfare? And also, fields wouldn't have been beautiful and rectangular like this. They would have been like permaculture, undulating with copses and corners that were hidden. So when the owner of the field says, leave her alone, he's also saying to his men, don't rape her, which makes us recognize that Me Too was happening then, as we've known that very much. The Book of Ruth is no cute story for children. The Book of Ruth is an extraordinary story, and that Boaz said, leave her alone, just means that he is the most basic level of fine. He is no hero in this book. Regularly I hear people say, oh, Boaz is the real hero. Under no circumstances is Boaz the real hero. Boaz just showed the most basic understanding about another person's bodily integrity. Don't rape them. That is not virtue. That's just the beginning of humanity, we hope. So that's what happens. That's the end of chapter 2. Chapter 3, sex comes in. It's very exciting. Ruth goes home to her mother-in-law and says, listen, I found a field where I can harvest. And her mother-in-law says, oh, what field? And she goes, field owned by a guy called Boaz. And Naomi goes, technically he's a relative of your dead husband. I wonder if we could marry into that family, because they owned property but they couldn't enact it because they were women. And so they needed to be tied to a local man in order to use the property that was in their name. So they were desperate really to have a marriage of convenience in order to be their own business people, these two women. And she said, there is another guy who isn't very nice. Let's find a way to see if we can ingratiate ourselves with Boaz. So Ruth, under Naomi's instruction, goes to the shed after the harvest is finished, and the men have had some wine and some dancing and some women, and then they're sleeping in the shed, or in the barn, and it says that Naomi says to her daughter-in-law Ruth the Moabite, when he's sleeping, Boaz, the owner of this field, go in and uncover his feet. Now, unfortunately for biblical purists, the word for feet and the word for penis are the same in Hebrew. So you can translate it whatever way you want. The Bible is not afraid of sex. And so that's what Ruth does. She goes in and she uncovers his, whatever you'd like to call it. And he seems to wake up. And then she seems to say, oh, I have a conversation with you. You're going to marry me because I need to be able to own my field. And then it says, the next morning, he sent her home with some seed in her apron. Now, you can interpret that in whatever way you want, okay? Maybe he gave her some actual seed because he thought maybe you need to make a bit of bread. Or maybe it's a literary device to speak about that they had sex and she was pregnant. Chapter 4. Suddenly, Boaz has to figure out, how do we engage with that other guy who is a little bit closer in relative terms to your dead husband, that guy who wouldn't be happy to have a marriage like that to allow you to be businesswomen. And so Boaz calls a meeting, and this guy comes along to it. And this guy is never given a name. The best way to translate the Hebrew description for him is so-and-so. In Ireland we'd say, your man, or what's his face, okay? So this guy, what's his face, so-and-so comes along. This is right in the Bible. It's deliciously entertaining. And Boaz says, I hear Naomi, because she can't use the land, is wondering about selling it. You're the first in line because you're the closest to the dead son. And the guy so-and-so goes, great, I'd love to get that piece of land. That'd be great. And Boaz goes, shame about the Moabite. And so-and-so says, what do you mean? And Boaz says, well, obviously if you acquire the land, you have to acquire the foreigner. And then so-and-so says, if I acquire her as my new wife, she will have foreign children and they will want to take my land from me. So he fantasizes his own fear. He projects it onto a person into their future and therefore enacts a impoverishing imagination in the present to protect himself from a badness that they haven't done yet. Does that sound like Black Lives Matter and the treatment that people are having? Because you might shoot me, I'll shoot you first. Because your hoodie might be some kind of thing that I want to consider concealment, I should be able to kill you now, just in case there's the possibility that you're not going to basketball, that you're actually out here wanting to kill me. Amazing. And people are protected in the way so they can project their fears onto people and then do criminal things in that moment because they want to project onto people that they might be a criminal in the future. It's the story of the world. Anyway, Boaz hears this from so-and-so and says, well, I'll marry her. And he goes, great. That way I don't have to have foreign children who'll steal my land. They do. They get married. They have that baby. Naomi changes her name back to Naomi instead of Bitter. And what's interesting is that the law has changed. Loving kindness has meant that the law has shown that belonging in community is based on behavior and not on blood. It's also shown that the future generations are recorded by people who enact it. The child that's born from Ruth is not named the son of her dead husband. Technically, that's what should happen in those kinds of marriage arrangements. If you've died and a male relative from that family marries you to give you a child, the child that comes from that is called the son or daughter of your dead husband. This child is called the son of Boaz and the son of Ruth. Extraordinary. And so the Book of Ruth doesn't tell you how you should vote when it comes to Brexit, but it does say, here's a moral behavior about belonging, about kindness, about law, about relationships, about community, about border crossing, and about social welfare. That's really robust in terms of our imagination about what civic belonging and civic democracy looks like. And so we put together 8 studies on this book, just 2 sides, they're not long chapters, just 8 studies on the Corrymeela website. And we started to run these events with people who voted for Brexit and people who voted against it and bringing people together. And we thought we would meet with 3,000 people in the course of a year, and I was a bit nervous to think, will we get that? We met 6,000 people. I ran one event in England, 500 people came along. Another event in England that we were expecting 75 came along. And people were desperate to be in situations where we could talk about this. And it was important to me to say at the start, look, people voted for Brexit for good reasons. You voted in whatever way you voted for all your reasons. I'm not interested in shaming anybody. I am interested in us thinking, what the hell do we do now? And how can we use moral imagination to do that? And how can a story hold us in this way? Because we can't fix on a story to do with Britain or Ireland because those are so contested and so long, whereas a 4-act book from the Hebrew Bible that has a really clear beginning and end, that has a dramatic cycle to it, and to my mind is inspired fiction, where some woman thought, we have the patron saint of sectarianism as our civic leader for Jerusalem. I know what we need. We need a story about a foreigner who returns us to ourselves. That's the sheer brilliance. Hello, Miranda.
Hi. I just wanted to tell you about 5 or 6 minutes.
Okay, grand job. Yeah. And so we have a report coming out in the next few weeks on the Corrymeela website, which you'd be welcome to look at. We have Corrymeela, is Corrymeela. So if you go to corrymeela.org/Ruth, you'll find all the resources, all 8 resources. And they don't just talk about Brexit, really they talk about borders and belonging. And for us, it is an agnostic project in the sense of that it is not designed to lead people into a deeper devotion to God or not God. It's there to lead us into a deeper devotion to practicing civic democracy ourselves. Some of the questions we ask is to say, find out what jurisdictions are in the room and see what has your jurisdiction held against your jurisdiction. So in Ireland, obviously, people would say, well, if I'm Irish and you're English, what has my imagination, my civic imagination, what did my family's political story teach me to hate about your group? And then to say, let's talk about that. And then let's consider, what does the Book of Ruth call people to in terms of the changing of an imagination and the deliberate, muscular practice of telling stories of kindness about the other, because we know damn well that currently Westminster is not going to tell good stories about Europe or Ireland. Currently Westminster is interested in escalating something, de-escalating the idea of the European Union as a peace project, and escalating the idea to say it's just about a trade deal and goods. Let's make it easy. Stop getting in the way. when the European lament is nobody's saying that the EU is perfect, but people are saying it has saved millions of lives from being killed in wars that haven't happened. And it's a damn good project to protect. Maybe it needs to evolve, maybe it needs to be reformed. I don't know if anybody's arguing against that, but certainly its deepest imagination is keeping a continent away from war with each other.